is an award-winning journalist, historian, and political activist from Sierra Leone. He is the author of The Ebola Outbreak in West Africa, Corporate Gangsters, Multinationals, and Rogue Politicians. And he's also the author of Neo-Colonialism in West Africa. He is the editor-in-chief of the Africanist Press, a media agency investigative journalism project focusing on democracy and free speech in Africa. One of their missions is to diagnose and remedy the causes of continued exploitation of the African continent. Cherno has joined us on many occasions to talk about Sierra Leone, issues of journalism and corruption. And over the last few years, he's published a series of articles outlining the levels of corruption in the Sierra Leone government under the government of the current president, that's Julius Bio. These articles have gotten international coverage and in the Africa sub-region. Cherno, thanks for joining Africa Today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Good. How is your family doing here and at home in Sierra Leone, Cherno?
Yes, everybody's doing fine. We have been coping with the situation as it unfolds in Sierra Leone with the increased repression, but so far my family members have been well and they've been concerned about the situation in Sierra Leone, but we are all safe at the moment. Okay. And we're very thankful to friends and allies who are looking after us for now.
A question about your journalistic background. You've doing this for a while, and I want you to let the listeners know about that. But the two books that you've written that we talked about, one which was the Ebola outbreak, and the other which was neo-colonialism in West Africa. How have they guided or inspired what you do with your journalism and what the goals, objectives are of the Africanist Press?
Yes, my books are basically an extension of the work that I do in the press. They are part of an effort to document in a collective volume some of the issues that I continue to explore in my investigative journalism work. And these are issues that deal with multinationals, that deal with corrupt regimes and politicians who have held on to the state, especially in West Africa, and used political power as a basis to advance their own selfish economic interests at the expense of the development of national economies in the region. So my books are not separate from my other journalistic work. They are an extension of that effort to bring to the attention of the rest of the world what is happening in my country and other neighboring countries that I have experienced this high level of corruption and the ongoing exploitation of the population of African people within West Africa.
Mm-hmm. The challenges, before we move into the specifics of your country, the challenges of being a journalist in this age of militarism, neoliberalism, and resource extraction. I note that when I looked on your site the other day, you were highlighting Jeffrey Moyo, New York Times reporter, who actually is being currently detained in Zimbabwe, and you noted a few other journalists, past and present, who've also. What are the challenges in this era of being a journalist and attempting to quote unquote speak truth?
Well, part of the situation we experienced in the rise of new dictatorship and the retreat or the contraction of democratic space across the world, and especially now in Africa, where regimes have become emboldened by the increased intensification of multinational activities and exploitation of vast resources, petroleum resources and other kinds of mineral resources. Now, they have developed new techniques and technology of governance that aimed at suppressing the vast majority of the African population. And what has made it much more complex is the fact that we have a youthful population that is now in conversation with the rest of the world. And with increased technology, these sectors of the African population are demanding their right as citizens, and governments cannot contend with that. So it's in between the growing aspiration of the vast majority of African people to realize the purposes of their own existence and the the effort of dictators, new-style dictatorships, to hold on to the old vestiges of exploitation and oppression. So journalists are caught in between that kind of environment to highlight this growing crisis of people wanting to be free, wanting more from governments, and also government leaders deciding to use power as a license to loot and to exploit wealth. Mm-hmm. And at the same time oppress people and hold on to that chain of exploitation that keeps developing for the last 50 or more years now.
Okay, let's come back to that discussion on the youthful population. The current president, Julius Bio, has been in office, elected 2018. I think he ran for office, and previously before that, he has military background. How do you assess his first 4 years in office, and also say something about where he came from in terms of his role with ECOMOG, the events in West Africa, and as part of one coup, I believe, if I'm correct?
Yes, Julius Maada Bio became a prominent figure in Sierra Leonean politics in the early 1990s when he was part of a group of young army officers who staged a coup that overthrew a then civilian government, and subsequent to that, he left office and was forced out of office by increasing demands for democratization in the mid-1990s. So he returned to Sierra Leone after over 20 years of being out of the country, and then became a leader of one of the political parties, the Sierra Leone People's Party, and lost an election in 2012 and was then elected with a narrow margin of less than 2% in a tight presidential race in 2018. His campaign was based on a promise to fight corruption, to reduce waste in public expenditure. But 4 years down the line, he has not been able to keep his electoral promises. And what we have documented is an increased level of corruption that involves the president and his wife and other members of his family and key officials in the government. And this has shown not just a level of state hypocrisy, but a lack of commitment to live up to the promises, the electoral promises that the party made, that this president made while he was campaigning for power. Mm-hmm. And now his fight against corruption, we have shown, is being used as a tool to muzzle the opposition, to entrench a hegemonic agenda in the country. And this is the crisis that we are dealing with. The increased suppression of the democratic space, higher levels of corruption, and an increased slide to dictatorship, where people's right to free expression, people's right to organize, has now been trampled upon. So the country is almost now governed by what could be characterized as a military government in civilian clothing. So that is apart from the levels of corruption, the increasing nature of the government and the passion of the president to become anti-democratic and dictatorial is now a reality that everybody in the country is contending with.
Okay. But before we talk about some of the specific articles which have recently been posted, what do you mean for our listeners when you use the word, or with the word, I know it was used in regard to Jacob Zuma in South Africa, state capture? What does that mean? Define that for us, Cherno.
Well, in this case, we have a situation, for example, in the case of Sierra Leone, where the president has gone to the extent of appointing key party officials to be part of leaders of independent institutions from the judiciary. We started with a situation where parliamentary majority was seized by the president with the use of the police, who invaded parliament. And then 10 members of parliament who were members of the opposition were also forcefully removed through the courts. And what that meant is that we have a forceful capture of parliamentary majority by the ruling party, and then the appointment of judges and development of salaries that make sure that judges and the judiciary is not independent. And this has been extended to civil society and the media to the level that now, as we speak, one of the leading opposition parties has just had its executive dismantled by a court decision, and you have a situation where there's a programmed effort by the current incumbent president to impose his own candidates as members of the opposition. So he wants to select candidates that will contest against him leading up to the election. So this is the result of an environment, a democratic environment that has been stifled, and where democratic institutions that should serve as a counterbalance between checkmate the activities of the executive arm of government have now been captured by the state through the use of state resources, the use of the police, and the use of executive orders by the president to impose, to rule by decree instead of rule by the Constitution.
Okay. You're listening to Channel Alpha Bar. He is the award-winning journalist. He is the founder and one of the editors of the Africanist Press. He's joined us here before in Africa Today to talk about developments throughout the continent in regards to journalism, but specifically in regards to his country of Sierra Leone. I'm looking at some of the headlines of recent pieces that you had posted, Cherno. And let's walk through a couple of them and then perhaps come to the one that refers specifically to the Africanist Press. One of the headlines recently was recent salary increases for Electoral Commission staff cast doubt over the possibility of free and fair elections in 2023. And then another one, which is titled Suspension of Audit and Evidence of Corruption Linking President's Family is Missing in the Fiscal Year 2020 Audit. Talk about the both of those in terms of the elections, which are set for 2023, as well as the way in which the audits from your article are being manipulated.
Well, the government has effectively proclaimed the fact that they claimed that they were going to fight corruption when they came in 2018. And what has come out clearly in the eyes of the people is that they've done the opposite. So because there is mass disappointment on the performance of the government, and there's an election coming up, what the regime has done is to set in motion a program to rig the next election. And one of the ways they intend to do that is by making sure that they appoint ruling party members and supporters into strategic position in the Electoral Commission. So you have a situation where all of the electoral commissioners, from the chairman of the commission to other constituent members of the leadership of the Electoral Commission, were appointed without following the required procedures of consultation with other sectors of the political opposition in the country. That in itself is a violation. Basically, the president imposed members or people who are likely to support his agenda as heads of the Electoral Commission, regardless of the criticism that he received from other sectors of the opposition, including even members of the international community, in this case the European Union. And so what we showed is the fact that apart from just making sure he has his own party members or supporters as head of the Electoral Commission, he has also developed incentives to incentivize the election management body so that his staff will find it necessary to ensure that the president continues in office, because that will mean that, by extension, they are also protecting their own privileges as members of the government. So one way to which he did that is by increasing their salaries, in some cases by 30 to 100%. And we've shown the evidence to that. That is part of the rigging mechanism that has been set in motion by the president. Mm-hmm. And another aspect is the fact that the government has been lending money from the IMF and the World Bank, and part of the criteria, the lending criteria, is that they have to enforce internal controls, internal audit. And we've come to discover that the government has dismantled the internal audit system in the country to the extent that they have unconstitutionally suspended the Auditor General and two of the most senior auditors in the country, because they were trying to investigate the president's use of money, his travel expenditure. And these were issues that were highlighted in some of the reports that we had covered before the audit exercise.
Who is the opposition in Sierra Leone, and the information that you're sharing with us and that you've shared from all the time that I've talked to you over the years? Who is knowing this information? Is the opposition civil society? Is it labor? Is it unions? Is it women's groups? And the issues that you're raising around the misuse of funds, is this a theme for discussion inside the country also?
Yes, there has been conversations around the country with more than 100 civil servants have been unfairly dismissed by the government secretly because they are rumored or suspected to be informants of the Africanist Press. But the issues we have raised are issues that have occupied the public conversation in Sierra Leone among ordinary people, and they have also been raised by some sectors of the opposition in Parliament. The Parliament has not held an inquiry into the conversation, but when we talk of the opposition, the opposition is under siege. As we speak right now, the leading contender to the president is accused of corruption and has a case in court based on a story that we published regarding the misappropriation of $4.6 million that was done by officials of the current government. So instead of prosecuting the individuals who were involved in that corruption scandal, the president decided to use the Anti-Corruption Commission to frame up his most feared contender. So the opposition in itself is fractured. There are members of the opposition who have been compromised by the ruling party, by the president himself. And like I said earlier, part of the plan is to have chosen candidates that will likely work to extend the current president's term of office to be the likely candidate that will contest against him in 2023. Mm-hmm. So the opposition, the real opposition, is under siege. Many of their leaders who are potentially people who will contest and are likely to defeat the president in an electoral contest, in a free and fair electoral contest, are being accused of corruption and are framed up in a judicial process. Mm-hmm. And that process has been ongoing endlessly. Mm-hmm. And because we have no independent judicial process, so there's likelihood that there's no justice in the entire proceedings. And sectors of the opposition that are in alliance with the ruling party favors that because they find a competitive advantage in their effort to struggle for power as well.
Mm-hmm. So why do you raise, Cherno, in one of the articles you raised the issue of the way in which the military was being reconfigured, and I asked that because of the involvement of the military in several countries, not only in West Africa but globally. And you mentioned that earlier on in the conversation. You used the word a militarized state. That's not out of the question from reading what you're saying. What gives you those thoughts? What gives the Africanist Press those thoughts?
Yes, apart from just highlighting corruption in the administration, what we hope is that the government will be able to address the issues of welfare that affect workers. And if issues of welfare are not addressed, we have this tense environment, we risk a situation of sliding into not just a dictatorship, but a situation of instability. And which is why we felt it is important to highlight the condition of workers in the country, condition of teachers who are badly paid, condition of healthcare workers, and also sectors of the security sector, including the correctional service, the police department, and the army itself. So we have shown that the vast majority of the military, for example, are suffering from lower wages, and these are issues that are affecting the army, and they are likely to cause unrest. So by highlighting these issues, we are basically drawing the attention of authorities in Sierra Leone and people who are concerned about peace in the region to understand that it's an existing problem that has to be addressed if we are concerned about peace and democratization, especially in West Africa, that is now increasingly becoming militarized, or where the army is increasingly stepping into the actual political space to resolve existing social problems that nation states are confronted with. And we do not want to have that kind of situation in Sierra Leone, which is why we are highlighting the failure of the government to live up to its electoral promises, the failure of the government to uphold the constitution, the failure of the government to rule by law, by the rule of law, and also the neglect of the political establishment in addressing the welfare of citizens, especially conditions of workers across the board, from the security sector to the teaching service and also the healthcare professions.
Mm-hmm. You noted in one of your articles the President's office takes steps to stop the publication of Africanist Press articles critical of Bio's regime. And so you're laying the point out that there's been attacks specifically on the information that you're putting out, specifically on the Africanist Press. Is that correct, Colonel?
Yes, many people have been victimized in the country because of our publications, including over 100 civil servants, like I mentioned, majority of whom are internal auditors within government, who are accused of having provided information to the Africanist Press. So these are ongoing crackdown of the civil service that has been going on silently, and these stories have not made it into the national press in Sierra Leone and outside. And now that the government has dismantled the internal audit system, they continuously see that we are relentless in exposing the ongoing corruption. The government has decided to use its own regulatory institutions to find a way of silencing the Africanist Press, to the extent that high-level security meetings have been held in Sierra Leone, and instructions were given by the Office of the President to find ways of shutting down. And we even published a letter from the Office of the President, the Office of National Security, requesting the Independent Media Commission to find ways of stopping the Africanist Press from publishing. And that is one of the unknown efforts. We've been receiving death threats from supporters of the government. We've been receiving text messages and phone calls of harassment and intimidation that has been ongoing for the last 2 years, as we continue to highlight corruption and mismanagement of public finances in the current administration led by Mr. Bio. So the government claims that they are friendly to press freedom. They've revoked anti-democratic legislations that target free speech, but in reality, they are constantly working to silence citizens who are speaking out freely against what is happening, to the extent that very recently even members of the opposition, members of ordinary citizens who have been identified to have said something that the government does not like are detained, arrested, including even a certified mentally challenged individual, a homeless man who made a video, was supposedly charged to court because he is accused of having insulted the president. And this is a known mentally challenged individual that was picked up on the street by the police. So that's the extent of the nature of the repression, the nature of the hostility to free speech that exists in Sierra Leone.
And the young people, we raised that earlier, the youthful. I'm asking here in terms of what's engaging to be engaged in this environment and to change this environment that the Africanist Press has talked about, meaning the youth, the African Union, international press organizations. Where has this sat in terms of discussion and on a road to change, Colonel?
Yes, as we look across the continent, we find that young people are increasingly active. They are increasingly demanding more concessions from government, more reforms, more democratic space. And this has been made possible by increased access to technology. In Sierra Leone, 85% of the population could be considered a youthful population below the ages of 35, many of whom are connected to the internet, and they have WhatsApp, social media applications that they're using, and they're in conversation with the rest of the world. That has been the constituency that the Africanist Press has been speaking to, because the traditional media itself has given us a news blackout. Nobody in the so-called traditional media in Sierra Leone, no radio station, virtually no television station, with the exception of few, are allowed to interview us about the stories we've been publishing. So we have only been able to reach the people of Sierra Leone through social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, and other forms of Twitter, and other forms of social media applications through which we disseminate our information. That's a hostile environment. The government has also been harassing people for even disseminating some of information. They even developed a new cyber legislation that targets the dissemination of information that the government thinks is not in the interest of the country. So they are even calling for the activation of that legislation against the Africanist Press. And one of the provisions of that is the request for the extradition of citizens who are outside of the country but are engaged in some of the work that we are currently doing to highlight the mismanagement and abuse of power, the mismanagement of public finance and the abuse of power by the current president.
Mm-hmm. And the AU, have they... Is there any action from the AU, any action from other international bodies that might make a difference? And the elections, when are they coming up, Cherno?
Yes, the current moment we have tried to report some of these harassment and intimidation that's coming from the government of Sierra Leone, especially the target against the Africanist Press. We have highlighted these with the Committee to Protect Journalists. We are also informing other human rights organizations about the unfolding situation in Sierra Leone. We are also calling on international partners of Sierra Leone, multilateral institutions who are engaged in the government of Sierra Leone to make it as a condition of their engagement, the democratization of the country, the respect for human rights, the enforcement of transparency mechanisms, and to ensure that the people of Sierra Leone are able to vote and vote freely in a free and fair election, that each and every individual who wants to participate in the election, either as a contender, must be allowed to compete fairly, that the president must ensure that there is a competitive electoral environment. People must have the right to vote and be able to vote. The elections are coming up in June next year, and because of that, the intensity of the repression has been intensified, and it's incumbent upon people who are concerned about peace in the world, who are concerned about democracy, to make sure that they assist the people of Sierra Leone, who have been calling, by the way, in the last 4 years, that the international community must pay attention to the abuses that are taking place, that the government has, because of the levels of state capture, has successfully duped the international community with its own propaganda, and they are thinking that the situation in Sierra Leone is democratic.
Okay, what is your website in our last few seconds here? Sharon, what's the website of the Africanist Press?
It's africanistpress.com, africanistpress.com.
Okay, for the last 25 minutes, we've been speaking with Cherno Alpha Ba. He is the editor-in-chief of the Africanist Press, africanistpress.com. You can take a look at their work. Cherno, thanks, and please be safe, and your family be safe. And it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Take good care, my friend.
Thank you.